Basically, men or women that are sociopaths or narcissists or domestic violence, they can put on a very good show and they're very charming. But don't fall for that. Listen to what the other person is telling you and make sure you know. Don't send them back to the Bible and say, well, the Bible says you have to forgive and reconcile. Hear what they're saying.
I'm Gretchen Baskerville, author of The Life-Saving Divorce, Hope for People Leaving Destructive Relationships. And today you'll meet Pam, a committed Christian from a great family whose parents have been married more than 50 years. You'll see she brought into her marriage all the right ingredients: a commitment to love, care, trust, give, and forgive. She approached the marriage full of hope and faith. Little did she know she'd married a clever man who'd concealed a secret life with lies and manipulation. Now let's jump into her story. And today I'm just so excited to hear Pam's story. Welcome, Pam. We are so glad to have you.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, Gretchen. I'm looking forward to speaking with you today.
Great. Okay, I'm going to start exactly in the same place I start with everyone, and that is, as a young girl, what did you hope or dream of or expect from marriage?
I had, mostly because I'd grown up in the church, I had really looked at marriage as a lifelong commitment, and I expected that I would find the right man and marry him and live happily ever after. And that, there wasn't that, it wasn't that I was disillusioned into thinking that it was going to be a piece of cake and a princess fairy tale kind of wedding, but I just figured that, it would just last forever because that's really what I'd known of marriages.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true for most of us raised in good traditional or faith-based homes. We really expect that this is our goal, our destiny, and what we really aspire to. So tell me a little bit about your parents' marriage.
So my parents have now been married 53 years, or will be 53 years next week. They have 2 kids, but took in foster children for years, and they set a pretty amazing example of what a marriage should be. It wasn't always easy, but there was never any unfaithfulness in the marriage. They, would always work things out, and they still do today. They do lots of things together, and they're, healthy and active, and it's a great relationship that they have.
I love hearing stories like that. And I think they're important for people to hear, of those of us who were brought up in great homes where there's wonderful devotion and faith, great examples from parents, and then we go in with the right expectations and the aspiration to be wives and mothers and whatever else we dream of. But those are key core values for us. So tell us how you met your husband and what attracted you to him.
So I actually met him when I joined an ambulance association locally. I became a volunteer, and he was already a volunteer there. And initially, I wasn't attracted to him, and I saw some red flags. And it was probably a couple years in, maybe a year after we met, that we were out at dinner, and I was on backup crew and he would just join the crews for dinner, and we were out, and both everybody that was with us left, and we ended up sitting and talking until about 2 o'clock in the morning, and found that, or it felt like, there was a lot of things that we had in common, is how I felt about it. And then my view of him sort of changed. And so there wasn't that initial, seeing him across the room and falling in love with him, but that relationship changed later on.
All right. And so how did the relationship grow, and how did you deal with the red flags?
Well, I think I became sort of blinded to those red flags when the relationship started, and it started on some pretty rocky grounds because he had been dating somebody else in that ambulance organization. And when we started dating, he told me that they had broken up. And I only found out after that she didn't know they had broken up. And years later, I actually reached out and apologized to her because I believed him when I should have believed her, and I never should have gotten into the relationship in the first place. But I think the biggest thing for me in the growth of that relationship ties to being lonely and wanting to be with someone. And I felt like I had found someone that loved me despite my being overweight, which has always been a factor for me, where I always felt like people rejected me because of my weight, and he didn't seem to mind.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. To feel like I'm finally accepted for exactly who I am, for my personality, for what I bring, for my intelligence, for what I bring to the party. And that's totally understandable. So, where was your relationship with God at this point?
I had been raised a Christian, and I believed without a doubt that, Jesus is my savior. But during those few years, I was not as active in church as I was growing up. I would go when I was at home with my parents, but for the most part, I lived about an hour and a half from there. I didn't go to church very often. I wasn't doing a lot of Bible study. So the relationship was there, but I certainly wasn't investing in that relationship.
And did he have any kind of faith background?
No, he was raised, he would have said he was raised Catholic, but I think it was they went to church a couple times a year and called themselves Catholic. And he had told me a story about when he was young and had talked to a priest about how can you say I'm going to hell because I'm living in hell here on earth? And he said the priest threw him out of the church. So I don't know, like in my mind, if I said that to a minister in a church I ever went to, they would sit down and want to talk to me and, talk through, well, what do you mean? So I don't know what actually happened in that circumstance, but no, he had no real involvement in church.
Okay. So here you found this connection, and he really sees you and values you. You see him and value him. How did it go toward marriage? Any red flags about the wedding or coming into that time?
Right before the wedding, he was running a business, and he lost that business. And I never really understood how or why the business went away. Looking back, it's easy for me to question it, but I wasn't marrying him because he had this business. I was marrying him because I wanted to be with him. So I was able to look past that, the fact that, he wasn't going to have an income and that I was going to be supporting him. But right before the wedding, I had this overwhelming sense of I shouldn't marry him. And it was short-lived, and I just attributed it to being pre-wedding jitters. And I married him, but I look back now and say, was that really God saying to me, don't do this? And I didn't listen, which is entirely possible.
Right. And, it's so hard to know. I mean, I think we go into these with the best of intentions.
Mm-hmm.
And, even if it was this nudge, needed to be a bigger nudge.
I've always said God should be hitting me with a 2x4,
Hit me with the 2x4 next time, God. Let's make it really obvious. So you thought, okay, he's lost his business, but he'll find something in the future. I would imagine you probably thought that.
Yep.
And so after the wedding, what happened?
It was only 5 months from the time we were married until the police were at my house to investigate the first time when he ended up being arrested. So it was, we had a very short honeymoon period, if you can even call it that. That was, somewhat stressful with only one of us working. His father was living with us. And then, in 5 months in, I faced with an investigation being done.
Do you mind telling us what the investigation was about?
Not at all. He was found to have uploaded and traded child pornography. And this goes back to the early 90s. So it was done on bulletin boards. And it was part of a large investigation out of Ohio where he was caught. and was arrested and convicted. They found hundreds of images on discs in our house, and I had no idea that they were there.
Wow.
And,
Wow. Now, when you tell people that, do they believe you?
they do now. I never talked about it before he got arrested the second time. I didn't tell anybody except the core group of people and my family members. So we just didn't talk about it. Once he served his time, we sort of just put it off in the back of our minds and
So
carried
the
it on.
second time he actually was arrested, went to jail
He
or
went
prison.
yeah. He went to prison both times, but I waited for him to get out the first time. He served for 13 months. And I was home with our young daughter and taking care of her, and then waited for him to come home.
Right. So what was going through your mind? I can well imagine what was going through your mind. You're thinking, my kid needs a dad. And, he sounds repentant. But tell me your story.
It was more that it wasn't so much the my kid needs a dad kind of thinking. It was, I'm not giving up on this marriage. It's till death do us part. And while he was in prison, he was serving time many states away because it was a federal offense, so it was a federal prison. He would get angry at me because I wasn't going to visit him often enough, or I hadn't saved up enough money to buy him things that needed to be replaced because of all of what had happened. And like, I was struggling with how angry I was at him, and the fact that I really felt that I needed to work through all these issues and make the marriage work. And at the time, I didn't believe that he had downloaded child pornography. His story was that it was adult pornography, and I believed it. You're only married 5 months, and you don't want to believe that of your husband. And I didn't. I believed that he was not in possession of it intentionally. And I even had to stand in front of the judge and tell the judge that when he came home, that I would never leave my daughter home alone with him. So for the first 3 years he was home from prison, I had to take my daughter and then my daughter and son with me everywhere I went. So if he was, even if he was home, I had to take them with me on errands, or, if I was going to my parents for the weekend or whatever I was doing, the kids came with me.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, sure. Hyper vigilant, always on top of everything. I want to go back to something. So you never saw any child porn. You never had any sense that he would ever be interested before the first arrest happened.
No, never saw any images. I never knew that any of the discs that they found existed. We even used the same computer, and it was dial-up internet. He had built in partitions, and that was early on in computer days, and I didn't know enough. He had built in partitions and was saving it on a part of the computer that I wouldn't typically have seen. And I had no reason to distrust him. So I was, it's not like I was going digging and looking for stuff. I believed what he said, and I just used what I wanted to use on the computer.
Did the FBI or the police or whoever came, did they tell you how they figured it out?
No, with the first time, I wasn't there when they came to serve the search warrant. I was at work, and they talked to him and his father, who was also home at the time, and everything I heard really was third party from him. I went to court a couple of times, but all I knew was what he had told me. And what his story was, that he had sent a picture to someone that it was supposed to be adult pornography, and that he ended up with this child pornography by mistake. And at the time, I didn't know any better, and I would think that, well, that would be pretty easy to do. But I know enough now to know that that's not easy. You can't just stumble across a picture like that and accidentally send it to someone.
That must have been an incredible, incredible shock. What did your father-in-law think of this?
Well, they have a very dysfunctional family. And from what I know now, he never told any of his relatives that his son had been arrested or that he went to prison, Like they found out when it happened the second time. Um, he, so my mother thinks that he probably knew and knew that Mike was doing it and knew stuff that was going on, but we'll never really know.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So 3 years later, that was much more of a public arrest, a much more of a public incident, it sounds like.
The second time was very different, and I know a lot more about computers than I knew back then. So yeah, it was very different. It was a state investigation. They found it when he accidentally uploaded an image from his computer up onto a SkyDrive. And there's all these algorithms that Microsoft uses, and they found the images that he uploaded, and then they track it back to where it came from. And of course, he tried to deny it and say it wasn't him and somebody else stole the Wi-Fi. But immediately I went back to, and I knew at that time that there was something wrong in our marriage. I didn't know what, but I knew there was something wrong. But it was just, I couldn't believe him. It wasn't like the first time around where I was just heartbroken and I believed him. This time, like, I was heartbroken, but I was angry and I thought he was lying. And the police wanted me to try and get him to tell the truth, and he wouldn't.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So at that point, what were you thinking about this marriage?
The day that they executed the search warrant the second time, and we're now 16 years into our marriage, I said, I am likely to divorce you. I don't think I can go through this again. So that was the day of the search warrant. I told him that. It was too much. It's overwhelming, and there's so much shame with those sorts of accusations and it feels like, even if it's not true, it feels like everybody's looking at you differently and looking at your kids differently because of him.
Yep, absolutely. You're worried about, will my children be stigmatized? Will I be stigmatized? Will people, point at me as I go through town and say, that's the woman who, or my children, will people just assume that maybe they've got some problems too? So I get that one loud and clear. So how soon after that did you actually move forward with the divorce?
It actually took me, I think 5 or 6 months. I was really struggling, and it went back to that I felt like marriage should be forever. And of course, he was writing me letters. So the search warrant was executed in March. He was arrested in April, and child services was involved right from the beginning, and they wouldn't allow him to stay at the house. But he would come during the day when the kids were at school, and begging me to stay with him and holding my hand like we were on our honeymoon. And that at that point, it was kind of that sick feeling, I don't want you touching me like this, it's too much. But he kept trying, and he spent months writing letters to me saying, I'll forgive you for everything you did. Why can't you forgive me? Why can't you be the Christian woman you're supposed to be? And I'm going to fight for us. I'm not giving up. And it took me 3 or 4 months and pushes from child services to go get therapy. And I walked into the therapist's office, and at that first visit, she said to me, what do you miss about him? And I thought, I have no idea. I missed the idea of what I thought marriage was, not him and what our marriage actually was. And that was finally the catalyst to say, okay, I'm probably going to divorce him. But it was still 4 or 5 months after that turning point before I, got it together and found an attorney and filed for divorce.
Got it. Well, I'm fascinated. So he used spiritual abuse. A good Christian woman like you ought to forgive me, or what were his messages there?
Yeah, so he said that I should be forgiving him. And initially, he found scriptures that he would send to me and tell me how those scriptures allowed me to leave the marriage. And I didn't respond, and I would get all worked up when I was reading these letters, to the point where my father and few other people, my sister, they said, stop reading his letters. So I had told my pastor, I'm going to stop reading his letters because it's hurting me too much to read them. And he said, oh, like, no, you don't want to do that. He's changed. And then the next letter that he encouraged me to read was more of the same. And it just made me so angry that I finally said, that's it. I'm done. I'm not talking to the pastor anymore about this. And I stopped reading them for a while, I had to make that break so that I could process my own feelings and deal with what this meant for me, because it meant not only the end of a Christian marriage, but it meant that I'm now a single parent, something I never could have imagined. And I'm not just a standard single parent. I'm a single parent to a child with bipolar disorder, a child with ADHD, a 5-year-old, and then my other one who was fairly easy at everything in his life. He's not better than the others, just different. So it was an enormous weight to realize I could be alone forever. And then you go back to the self-esteem issues with I'm overweight and nobody's going to want to be with me and I don't want to be alone forever. So it was all those games in my mind for several months before I finally realized that I am way better off by myself. Even though I'm lonely, I'm way better off by myself than I am in a marriage that's that toxic. Some of all those feelings are coming back.
Oh, bless you. I'm so sorry, and yet I know you're happy to be gone, but it's hard to relive, those feelings for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever believe at any point during this marriage that he could change?
Yes, because that's, anybody, Jesus can change anybody if that person is willing to be changed. So, I would pray for him. We went to church together, every week. There was all of these things, but then when it came to this arrest again, even if he did change, it was going to change my entire life, because now he's going to be on the sex offender for the registry for the rest of his life. And that means I'm going to be a single parent whether or not he lives in my house. So it's, like that, all of those things are going on in your mind, and you're battling with, well, the church says I should stay in this marriage and I should do everything to reconcile. And I was being pushed to reconcile. And at the time, I was tying forgiveness and reconciliation together. I couldn't see that it was possible to forgive him and not have any real relationship with him, there are still some days where I don't think I've forgiven him, but there are days where I feel like I have, and I think it's a process. But I now feel, after all this, that it's okay for me to forgive him, but to not have a relationship, because it's not a safe relationship.
Right, absolutely. Did you have anyone tell you, these men with these problems don't ever change? Did any professional eventually say that to you?
Yes, the therapist that I went to, she was a not pulling any punches kind of therapist, which is kind of what I need. It goes back to the 2x4 kind of thing. And she said to me, and this was early on, she said, he's a sociopath, and that behavior isn't going to change, and you can't trust him. And so like she could see just from what I was telling her that there was an issue there, that even if he does change, you can't ever trust that he has changed, because of, that can go on for a long time.
Right. The other thing I hear a lot of misinformation on pedophiles and things like that is that they're gay and they wouldn't be married and they wouldn't have children with a woman. What do you say to people who say that?
I think that it's like anything else in life, that some may be gay and some may not be, because there's so many examples out there of pedophiles who nobody ever would have suspected. They have a normal relationship with a woman that you wouldn't think anything of. So I think it's the homophobia that so many people have being tied to a few, but really it's that there's a completely separate issue. It's that it's the pedophilia. They are interested in children, and it may be boys, it may be girls, but it's not really that they're homosexual or heterosexual. It's that they love children.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell
Yeah.
me, how did your children deal with him? What is their relationship like now?
My oldest is in touch with him. She sees him periodically, and she's an adult, so she can see him, as she wishes. But they'll go out to dinner, or recently he met her nearby so she could get birthday presents from him. But she's cautious, which is good because I worry about her vulnerability. The next one down will have absolutely nothing to do with him. He won't say anything more than he lied to me about why he wants nothing to do with his father, but he feels very strongly he wants absolutely nothing to do with him. Hasn't spoken to him since the day of the search warrant being executed. So it's been 5 years. The number 3 was really angry when I wouldn't let him come home. I kept trying to tell her, he's in prison. They don't let me just go in and get him and bring him home. And then she seemed to forgive him, and she went and saw him, and she was not communicating regularly because she's a minor, so she has to have supervised visits. And then my little one was so very young that I think she's more innocent than the others, but she's very bright, and she understood right from the beginning that, not all of the details, but she understood that relationship was going to change, and that she couldn't trust him, but she still loves him, and people from church took her to see him in prison, the pastor and his wife. And they've taken her a couple times a year to see him for dinner or whatever, for birthday and Christmas. So she doesn't see him much. I know she'd like to see him more, but I don't want to supervise because I don't want to see him, and it always feels like a burden to me. And when she asks, I arrange it. Or, maybe my oldest daughter can arrange stuff for her, but I don't ever push that relationship. There are some that probably would say that I need to, but there's a piece of me that says they're very vulnerable with him.
Right, right. So who supervises when an outside supervisor is required, which is always.
It's been my pastor every time. He has, I forget, he has to approve of the supervisors. And the parole officer has to approve of the supervisors. And there's one man that's on that list of supervisors that I don't think he would do anything malicious as far as allowing him unsupervised time or anything like that. But I think he trusts him more than he should. So that concerns me. So, I don't approve of that supervisor. And my mother had said that she would supervise so that to go see, and my ex wants nothing to do with my mother.
Yeah, I bet that's not going to go very far.
Yeah.
Mom and her baseball bat.
Yeah. So it's just been the pastor and his wife.
Yeah, right. So this sounds like an interesting interaction now with the pastor. Is this the same pastor who encouraged you to stay the first time?
It actually, well, so he encouraged me to stay after the second arrest. I didn't know him at the time of the first one.
Okay. Wow.
But at the time of the second one, he and this other man at church were pushing me to reconcile and telling me how much he'd changed, and they were working with him. And I finally went into him one day, and this was around the time that I was finally getting to the point where I was thinking I wanted to divorce him. And I said to him that, you need to, because he finally said to me, if I were your daughter, if you were my daughter, I would tell you to divorce him. And I said, I'm so glad you finally said that, because that's not the message I was getting from you, and that's not how you were making me feel. And he said, I always thought you knew you had biblical grounds. So
Wow.
he knew I had enough of a background to know that I should, but I don't think, because this was such a new thing for him too, that he realized how much of a struggle that was for me to know that in one place it's saying you need to stay married, till death do you part, and in another place it's saying it's okay to divorce, and that's.
Well, I think you just brought up something so important, and I hope that any pastor listening to this gets your message loud and clear, and that is, don't be so passive, pastors. When you see something like this, you need to say, hey, you've got biblical grounds for divorce. This would be a valid divorce in God's eyes. This is a life-saving divorce. It's your choice. But if you were my daughter, I'd get you out of there. And I wish more pastors would say that, because too few do. They wash their hands of it and they don't want any responsibility for it. And what's happening is they're really betraying their shepherding role in their church.
Yeah, I think that there's also a fear from them that they're pushing them when it should be God. Like they feel you should be led by God, and they think that if they say, well, I think you have grounds for divorce, that it's the same as telling somebody you should go get a divorce. So I think that that's a very different message, and that's where it becomes important. And even if it's not a divorce, because in some cases it's domestic violence, maybe it's not a divorce, but to be able to tell them that you need to not be in this relationship and it's not a safe place to be is something that we need from church leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, are you in a state that you did okay in the legal divorce process?
I actually had a very easy divorce. Because he was in prison, so he didn't come. He didn't respond to the filing. And because of the circumstance, it typically would have been that I would have had to pay alimony to him if he wasn't in prison and under these circumstances. And I was all worked up, and my attorney said, why are you worried about that? Like, why didn't you just ask me? Well, because I thought it was going to cost me money to ask you questions. But I went in and I had to sit in front of the judge with my attorney with me, and they just walked me through a few questions asking about finances. And of course I had to provide financial information, but the courts were very supportive of keeping the kids protected and allowing me to keep the financial assets because I'm having to take care of all of the kids.
Right, right. And you were still the primary wage earner at that point in the marriage?
Yes, I was. Right after he lost his business, essentially, I was the primary wage earner right through the entire
all the way
marriage.
Through the whole marriage. Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay.
Yep.
So, wow, a million questions I've got for you. Let's go back to the pastor thing. What message would you give to pastors right now? If you could speak to all the pastors in America, what would you say to them?
To listen very carefully to what someone is telling you when they're talking about their marriage. Don't assume that the man or woman that you're seeing is the real person that lives in the house with the other spouse. So I know that sounds so wishy-washy, but basically men or women that are sociopaths or narcissists or domestic violence, they can put on a very good show and they're very charming in a lot of cases. But don't fall for that. Listen to what the other person is telling you and make sure you know. Don't send them back to the Bible and say, well, the Bible says you have to forgive and reconcile. Hear what they're saying.
Right. Okay. Now, I'm also confident there are women right now who either suspect that their husband is a pedophile or is doing child porn, or they know, and they don't know what to do. They either think that that enough prayer and enough love and enough sex will fix him, or, they're confused. What do you say to them?
I would say to them, if they know or have a real suspicion that at a minimum they should not leave their own children or any other children with that person that they suspect. And I would also say that if they can leave, even if it's not permanent or a divorce, that they should do so. And this takes an enormous amount of strength, because I was torn and he was already being arrested. If you have the strength to do it, turn them in, because there was a time 15, 20 years ago where I thought that child pornography was a victimless crime. But as part of this search warrant, they showed me the 3 pictures that he had uploaded, and those images are burned into my head. And it is not a victimless crime. There are kids that were harmed in the making of that child pornography. And even if it means your spouse is going to have consequences for that behavior, you need to protect the kids that are being harmed.
Wow, great message. Can I ask you some other questions then on different topics? All right. So, I mean, you're a classic example of a wife who held out hope even in a very destructive situation. What did it take for you to really accept reality? Like, this is over. Because up until that point, you were telling yourself something else.
So the one thing I did when the search warrant came is I went on a mission to find the truth. And this is something that I recommend to people in a group that I'm in, that pray that God shows you the truth of what your marriage is, even though it's hard and it hurts, but you need to know what you're facing. So I went on Google searches and I found lots of stuff. And I went looking for the truth in all of the situation, because if you choose to stay, you need to know that. But if you choose to leave, you need to know why. So I think, my pastor would question me on that. Why does it matter? It matters because when I walk away, I want to know this is why I walked away. Not this question in my mind of maybe he was doing this, but this is what he was doing. And these are the reasons that it's not safe anymore.
So what kinds of things would you Google?
Well, the search warrant that I had, which gives me an advantage over many people, had several email addresses listed in it. So I Googled the email addresses, or I Googled, when you Google an email address, it sometimes will create an email. But so let's say his email address was john123@gmail.com. I would search for John123. And in doing so, with one of his email addresses, I went probably 7 or 8 pages deep into these searches. I actually found where he had advertised online for women.
Oh, wow.
While he was home taking care of my number 3 child. So it was several years into our marriage. And that, it's those little things that you're looking for and digging for, and you may not find anything, but odds are, if they're doing stuff online, that there's going to be things that you come across.
Okay, so you wanted to know the worst of the worst.
Mm-hmm.
You just wanted the truth at any cost.
Yep.
And you were
I
willing
did.
to. Now, okay, so I'm going to ask you a crazy question. People like Jerry Sandusky's wife, Dottie Sandusky,
Mm-hmm.
she defends him to the end. She defended him to the end. What do you make of those wives?
I think that in some cases, those women are blinded either by, it could be narcissistic behavior, or it could be they don't want to believe. And I think that all of us have sort of a gut instinct on when something is wrong that we need to follow, but it's easy to make that gut instinct go away and say, no, that's not true. I really love him. Or, it could be that they don't want to give up the lifestyle that they have. And I think that could definitely be the case with Jerry Sandusky's wife. But I think if you really want the truth and you really want to understand that it's okay to stay with him, but you need to find out what the truth is before you stand up for them.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes. Try to know the whole truth.
Right.
So for you, digging up the truth made you realize this is really over.
In part 1, you heard the overview, and in part 2, we dig deeper as she talks about why wives of pedophiles often don't know the truth about their husbands, and why it is so important to seek the truth no matter how brutal. She talks about rebuilding her life after the divorce and how she dealt with anger, fear, and forgiveness. She talks about safe churches and friends and how her kids are dealing with the realization that their father is incarcerated for child pornography. So click on the link now.